The fluorescent light above the checkout register flickered twice before it steadied itself, casting that pale, antiseptic glow over everything, the kind of light that makes everyone look tired. I was standing in the self-serve aisle at Woolworths, holding a basket with 2 bottles of red wine and a block of Tasmanian cheese, because Dorothy had asked me to pick up something nice for dinner. Simple enough errand for a Tuesday afternoon. I was 63 years old. I had built a commercial property development company worth $42 million across the eastern seaboard, and I was standing in a supermarket trying to remember whether my wife preferred the King Island Brie or the Piangana cheddar. That was when I looked up. The woman on register 4 was moving slowly, with the careful, deliberate economy of someone managing pain they had decided not to acknowledge. Her uniform shirt pulled tight across a stomach that told me she was at least 8 months along. Her left hand rested on the edge of the conveyor belt between customers, not lazily, but the way a person grips a railing on a steep staircase. She was keeping herself upright through sheer determination. I watched her scan a tin of baked beans for the elderly man in front of her, and something about the angle of her neck, the particular way she tilted her head slightly to the left, made the back of my throat close over. I knew that gesture. I had watched that same tilt across my dining room table for 3 years. My daughter-in-law, Renee, who my son Marcus had told me, packed her bags and left for the Northern Territory with another man 8 months ago, was standing under the fluorescent lights of a Woolworths in suburban Brisbane, scanning groceries on a Tuesday afternoon. The wine bottle in my basket suddenly felt very heavy. She had not seen me yet. Her eyes were fixed on the register screen, her fingers moving through the motions of the job with the glazed efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough that thinking was no longer required. I stepped out of the self-serve aisle and into her queue without deciding to. My legs moved before the rest of me had agreed on a course of action. There were 2 people ahead of me. I stood there and watched her, and everything I thought I had understood about the past 8 months began to rearrange itself into a shape I did not recognize. She looked up when the woman ahead of me moved away. The color left her face in the space of one breath. For a moment, neither of us moved. The conveyor belt hummed between us. Somewhere behind me, a child was asking its mother for chips. The refrigeration units along the back wall breathed their cold, mechanical breath. "Hello, Renee," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She looked down at the register, her lips pressed together. "Mr. Calloway," she said, very quietly. "I'm sorry. I can't, please. I just need to finish my shift." "I'm not here to cause you any trouble," I said. "I only want to talk." "You should go," she said. Her hands were shaking as she tried to scan the item from my basket. The scanner beeped 3 times without reading it. "Please, if he finds out I spoke to you, he'll use it. He said if I ever made contact with anyone in your family, he'd go straight to the lawyers." She finally got the scan to register. Her eyes did not come up to meet mine. "He has a file on me, Mr. Calloway. He's been building it for months. He says I'm not fit. He says he can prove it. Marcus, my son. I paid for the wine and the cheese." I put my card back in my wallet. My hands were perfectly steady because I had spent 40 years in boardrooms learning to keep them that way regardless of what was happening inside my chest. I looked at the name badge on her uniform shirt. It said Renee, and under that it said team member. "What time does your shift end?" I asked. She hesitated for a long moment. A man behind me cleared his throat. 6, she finally said. "I'll be in the car park," I said. "Blue Holden, near the trolley bay. You don't have to come, but I'll be there." I walked out into the Brisbane afternoon and sat in my car for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I called Dorothy and told her I'd been held up. I did not tell her where or why. I sat and looked at the entrance to the supermarket and tried to recall the exact sequence of events that Marcus had given me 8 months ago when he came to the house looking like a man who'd been hit by something large and slow-moving. He had sat at my kitchen table and told Dorothy and me that Renee had been carrying on with someone she'd met through her work as a physiotherapist. He said he'd found messages on her phone. He said he'd confronted her and she'd admitted it, packed a bag, and left. He said she'd taken $6,000 from their joint account on the way out. He said she told him she was going to Cairns, but nobody had heard from her since. I had believed him without asking a single question that mattered. She came through the automatic doors at 6:04. She had changed out of her uniform into a gray hoodie that sat stretched over her belly. She stood at the entrance and looked toward the trolley bay, and I turned on the headlights twice. She walked over slowly and lowered herself into the passenger seat with the careful negotiation of a woman in the final weeks of a pregnancy nobody was helping her through. For a moment, she just sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the dashboard. "He told you I left," she said. It wasn't a question. "He told me you left," I said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "I didn't leave," she said. "He made it so. I had no choice but to go." She talked for a long time. I did not interrupt. Outside, the car park emptied slowly around us as the early evening shift changeover happened, and shoppers loaded their boots and drove home to their dinners. Renee and Marcus had been married for 3 years. For the first year, she told me, things had been the way I remembered them, genuinely good, or at least genuinely ordinary, in the way good marriages are. Then a woman named Sasha came into the picture. Renee described her as a business contact of Marcus's who had gradually become something else entirely. She had started appearing at family dinners with thin excuses. She had opinions about how Marcus and Renee's apartment was decorated. She spoke to Renee with a particular brand of politeness that was specifically designed to make a person feel small. "The gaslighting started small," Renee said. She was looking out the windscreen, not at me. He'd deny conversations we'd had. He'd tell me I'd agreed to things I never agreed to. He told me once that I'd invited Sasha to our anniversary dinner, and that I'd forgotten. I hadn't, Mr. Calloway. I never did. I said nothing. I listened. She described the progression of it with the flat, careful tone of someone who has processed a thing so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth by repetition, but the facts remain sharp. The joint account drained gradually through transfers Marcus made to a business account she didn't have access to. The lease on their apartment put solely in his name when renewal came around. Her name removed from the emergency contact list at Marcus's GP, replaced with Sasha's name, without Renee being told. Small removals. Careful, methodical erasure. Then she found out she was pregnant. "I thought it might change things," she said. And her voice was very quiet on those words. I know that sounds naive. I knew it was naive even when I was thinking it. But I thought when I told him, something would shift. She stopped. He told me it was inconvenient timing. That's the word he used. Inconvenient. And then Sasha was in our kitchen the next morning, and she looked at me with this smile I can't describe to you. And I understood then that the decision had already been made and I wasn't part of it. The final confrontation, she told me, happened on a Sunday night in April. Marcus had told her that he'd been consulting a family lawyer and that if she tried to claim anything from the relationship, he would contest it on the basis of her mental instability. He had, over the preceding months, been documenting incidents, arguments he had manufactured, moments of distress he had deliberately provoked, and presenting them to the lawyer as evidence of her being unfit. He told her that if she left quietly and made no claim on the property or any joint assets, he would agree not to pursue the custody question. He said if I fought him, he'd take the baby, she said. He said he'd have me assessed. He said he had a psychiatrist friend who would write whatever report he needed. She turned and looked at me for the first time since she'd gotten in the car. Her eyes were exhausted in the specific way of people who have not felt safe enough to sleep properly in a long time. I believed him. I still believe him. That's why I ran. How long have you been in Brisbane? I asked. 7 months, she said. I had enough savings in my own account for the bond on a room in a share house. I got the Woolworths job in my 3rd week here. My manager knows I'm pregnant. She's been good to me. Are you seeing a doctor? The Mater Hospital. Public system. Everything's fine with the baby. They tell me he's healthy. A small, complicated expression crossed her face. It's a boy. I sat with that for a moment. I had a grandson coming into the world in what looked like 3 or 4 weeks. Living in a rented room in a Brisbane share house, and I had spent 8 months eating Dorothy's dinners and accepting my son's version of events without once picking up the phone to try to find the woman carrying him. I am not a man who cries easily. I built my first development project at 26 with money I borrowed from my father and a business partner, who I later discovered had tried to shortchange me on the land title, and I resolved that dispute without raising my voice. I have negotiated, outlasted, and occasionally outmaneuvered people far smarter than me over 4 decades of commercial property, and I have learned in that time to treat emotion as information rather than instruction. I register it. I note it. And I continue. But sitting in a Woolworths car park in Brisbane, while my pregnant daughter-in-law told me calmly that my son had methodically dismantled her life and that she had been folding other people's grocery items across a scanner. For 7 months, because she had nowhere else to go, I felt something go very still and very cold at the center of me. You're not going back to that room tonight, I said. She started to protest. I raised one hand. It's not a discussion. I'll call Dorothy right now, and she'll have the guest room made up before we get there. You're not staying another night in a share house while you're this close to term. I paused. Unless you don't want that. If you're not comfortable coming to us, tell me, and I'll book you into the Emporium, and you'll have nothing to worry about. But you're not going back to that room. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a woman was wrestling a trolley with a broken wheel across the asphalt. He might find out I'm in Brisbane, she said. Let him, I said. That's my problem now, not yours. I called Dorothy from the car, while Renee directed me to the share house to collect her things. Dorothy asked 3 questions, none of them about Marcus, and then told me to drive carefully. That was something I had always loved about my wife. She understood when the full explanation needed to wait. Renee's possessions fit into one large duffel bag and a canvas tote with a library book in it. The room was clean and small and had a picture of a coastal landscape on the wall that she'd clearly put up herself. I carried the bag to the car and thought about how long I had been looking at the view from my office on the 42nd floor of a building I owned, while my daughter-in-law was putting that picture up on a wall because she needed one thing in the room that felt like hers. We drove to Fig Tree Pocket in mostly comfortable silence. Dorothy met us at the door and folded Renee into a hug without preamble or explanation, the way only women of a certain age know how to do. I heard Renee make a sound against Dorothy's shoulder that she had probably been holding in for 8 months. I took the bags down the hall and put them in the guest room and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the river. Then I went to my study and shut the door and began making phone calls. The first was to Gordon Thwaite, a forensic accountant I had used twice in 20 years when things got complicated with property settlements. Gordon did not enjoy being called at 7 in the evening, but he owed me a favor and he knew it. I described what I needed, and he said he'd have his preliminary findings in 48 hours. The second call was to Patricia Neville, a family law solicitor who had the reputation in Brisbane legal circles of being extraordinarily thorough and somewhat terrifying. She asked me to send her a written summary by morning. I wrote it that night between 9 and midnight at my desk while the house was quiet. The third call, the one I sat with for the longest time before making, was not a phone call. It was a message to Marcus. Short, measured. It told him that I had been in contact with Renee, that she was safe, and that I expected him at my home on Saturday morning to have a conversation. Nothing accusatory. Nothing that would make him go to ground before I had what I needed. He replied 40 minutes later. The message said he was relieved to hear she was safe and that he'd be there. That night, after Dorothy and Renee had both gone to bed, I sat in the back garden with a glass of water and listened to the river. The night was warm and the fig trees were enormous dark shapes against the sky, and I thought about the last time I had seen Renee before Marcus told me she had gone. It had been a Sunday lunch at our place. She had helped Dorothy with the dishes after, and I had heard them laughing about something in the kitchen, one of those easy, unself-conscious sounds that means two people genuinely like each other. Marcus had been on his phone most of the meal. I had noticed. I had said nothing. I had mistaken busyness for normality for 3 full years. Gordon called me on Thursday morning. His voice had the careful, measured quality he adopted when what he had found was worse than he'd expected. He had traced the $6,000 that Marcus claimed Renee stole from the joint account. It had been transferred to the joint account from Renee's own savings the month before a deposit she'd made toward a pram and nursery furniture. Marcus had then transferred it out into a separate account 2 days before the Sunday confrontation and reported it as Renee's withdrawal in the records he'd provided to the family lawyer. The joint account also showed a pattern of withdrawals over 14 months that corresponded with transfers into an account registered to a company called Stellarfield Consulting. Gordon confirmed within another 24 hours that Stellarfield Consulting had been registered by Sasha, full name Sasha Drummond, and that the total amount transferred was approximately $94,000. Some of it had come from the development business. Marcus was a silent partner in 2 of my smaller Queensland projects, and he had found a way to reclassify consulting fees through Sasha's company using invoices that were, as Gordon put it, with professional restraint, not supported by any evidence of actual consulting services rendered. $94,000. Not a fortune by the scale of what I had built, but enough to tell me that this had been planned over more than a year and that my son had spent that year sitting at my Sunday lunch table and asking Dorothy if she wanted more gravy. Patricia Neville called Friday afternoon. She had reviewed the documentation Renee had kept, and here was something I had not fully understood yet. Something that made me stop and reassess everything. Renee had not run empty-handed. She was a physiotherapist. She was trained in the methodical documentation of patient progress. She had applied the same habits to her own situation. In the months before she left, she had photographed text messages, kept a written log of incidents with dates and times, taken screenshots of account transfers, and stored all of it in a cloud folder with automatic backup that Marcus did not know existed. She had walked out of that marriage with nothing but a duffel bag and a canvas tote, and she had taken the most important thing with her. Patricia said, "She's not a victim, Raymond. She's a witness. There's a difference, and it matters enormously." I went to Renee on Friday evening and sat with her in the back garden while Dorothy brought out tea neither of us particularly wanted. I told her what Gordon and Patricia had found. I told her she needed to know the full shape of it before Saturday. She listened with that same careful steadiness she'd had in the car park, and then she was quiet for a moment. "I knew about the transfers," she said. "I found the first ones about 18 months ago. I didn't know the total." "Why didn't you come to us then?" I asked. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question that I needed to understand. She looked at her hands. "Because he told me you'd take his side," she said simply. "He said you'd built everything for him and you'd never believe anything that threatened that. He said you'd think I was trying to take what wasn't mine." She paused. "And honestly, Mr. Calloway, I wasn't entirely sure he was wrong." That landed with the particular weight of a truth I could not argue with. because she was correct that I had not given her a reason to be certain otherwise. I had been a present father-in-law at Sunday lunches. I had not been a safe place. Raymond, I said. She looked at me. My name is Raymond. Not Mr. Calloway. She nodded once. Something very slightly shifted in her expression. Marcus arrived at 9:15 on Saturday morning. He was wearing a good shirt, and he looked relaxed in the way of a man who has decided he knows how this conversation will go. He came into the kitchen and kissed Dorothy on the cheek and accepted a coffee and said it was a relief that Renee was somewhere safe, even if the circumstances were complicated. I let him talk for a few minutes. I watched the way he arranged himself in his chair, the way he turned his coffee cup on the saucer. He was my son. I had taught him to ride a bike in this suburb. I had watched him graduate and helped him buy his first apartment and brought him into the business at 28 because I believed in his instincts. Somewhere along the line, between 28 and 34, something had occurred in Marcus that I had either caused or failed to prevent, and I would carry the weight of that question for the rest of my life. But that Saturday morning, it was not the weight of that question I needed to deal with. I placed Gordon's report on the table. Then, Patricia's preliminary brief. Then a copy of the cloud folder index that Renee had printed for me, 22 pages of logs, screenshots, and documented incidents. Marcus looked at the documents and then at me. The relaxed expression became something else. He said my name. I did not respond. He said I didn't understand the full picture. I told him I understood the picture well enough. He said Renee had poisoned me against him. I said Renee had been in Brisbane scanning groceries for 7 months and had not once tried to contact me, which was something worth sitting with. He tried 3 more angles. I let him try each one. Then I slid a folder across the table that Patricia had prepared. It contained a statutory declaration for Marcus to sign acknowledging the transfers, returning the funds, releasing any custody claim, and agreeing to a clean settlement that Patricia had calculated as appropriate. The alternative, I told him, was that Gordon's report and Renee's documentation went to the ATO and the Queensland Police. The consulting fee arrangement qualified as tax fraud. The manufacturing of evidence for the family lawyer qualified as other things Patricia could explain in detail if he preferred. "You'd do that to me?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "You did it to her first," I said. He was not the man I thought I had raised. But he was not entirely stupid, either. He signed the declaration. He did not look at me when he left. Dorothy had taken Renee to the garden during the meeting. When I came out to tell them it was done, Renee looked at me with an expression I found difficult to read. Not relief. Exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a person who had spent a long time in a situation where no good options existed, and who now found themselves suddenly in a landscape where things might, carefully, begin to improve. It takes time to trust that feeling. It takes longer to stop waiting for the other shoe. "It's done," I said. He signed. "Patricia will file next week. You won't have to fight him for anything." Renee nodded. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea. "And the baby?" she asked. "Your son," I said, "will have his birth certificate filed however you choose to file it. Marcus has released any claim." I paused. "Unless you want him involved, that's your decision to make, not mine." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to take a father from him," she said. "I just want to be safe." That was the sentence that stayed with me longest from that whole affair. Not the figures in Gordon's report. Not Marcus's expression when he looked at the folder. That one sentence, "I just want to be safe." She had not asked for the apartment or the money or the retribution or even the acknowledgement. Though she deserved all of those things, she had wanted, at the most fundamental level, to be in a position where she and her child could exist without fear. and she had been trying to build that from a rented room in a share house in Brisbane, alone, at 31 weeks pregnant, on a supermarket wage. The baby arrived on a Thursday night, 2 weeks and 3 days after Renee moved into our guest room. It was not a dramatic arrival. Dorothy drove her to the mater at 10 in the evening. I followed in my car and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours reading 3-month-old copies of magazines I had no interest in. At 2:14 in the morning, Dorothy came through the door with an expression on her face that I had not seen since Marcus was born and which I had not expected to see again. "He's here," she said. "He's perfect." They let me in after about 20 minutes. Renee was pale and tired, and she had the particular look of a person who has just done the hardest thing and is still not entirely sure they're still in their own body. The baby was in a transparent crib beside the bed, wrapped in the hospital's standard white blanket, with the dark, red-faced intensity of all newborns who have not yet worked out what to make of any of this. I stood at the side of the crib and looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to call him Daniel," Renee said from the bed. "Daniel. Edward. That's a good name," I said. She asked if I wanted to hold him. I said yes, and a nurse showed me how to support his head, which I had forgotten in 34 years, and I stood with him by the window while Brisbane went about its night business. 11 floors below, and Daniel Edward examined the ceiling with the absolute concentration of someone encountering existence for the first time. I had been 400 kilometers away when Marcus was born. There had been a project complication in Sydney. I had flown in the next morning. I had told myself for 34 years that it hadn't mattered, that he'd never known the difference, that the work had been necessary. Standing by that window, I understood with complete clarity that I had told myself a useful lie. In the weeks that followed, our house became something different from what it had been. Not noisier, exactly Daniel was. To everyone's relief, a reasonably settled baby, but more inhabited. Renee's physiotherapy registration had remained current throughout her absence. A professional discipline she had maintained even when everything else was coming apart. And within 6 weeks of Daniel's birth, she had begun making inquiries about returning to practice. I set her up in the study to make calls and do the administrative work involved. Dorothy took Daniel for the mornings she needed. Patricia finalized the settlement in the 8th week. The $94,000 was returned in full. The property interest was resolved, and Renee received what she was properly entitled to from the marriage. It was not a windfall. It was fair. I had 2 further conversations with Marcus during this period. They were difficult. They did not resolve into something clean or forgiving. He said things that were not true, and I let them be untrue rather than argue. He said things that were true, and those were harder to respond to. He said once that I had always held him to a standard I never explained clearly, and that by the time he understood what I expected from him, he had already developed other methods. I did not have a good answer for that. I still do not. He is my son, and I failed him in ways that preceded Renee and preceded Sasha Drummond by a long time, and the work of understanding exactly where and how and what might have been different is the kind of work that does not produce neat conclusions. I am still in the middle of it. What I am certain of is that failing to see the rot in someone you love does not excuse you from responsibility for the damage it causes. I had been present at meals and absent in the ways that actually matter, and those are not the same thing as being a good father. Renee found a flat in West End at the 4-month mark. A ground floor, 2-bedroom with a garden that Daniel could eventually use. I helped her move on a Saturday in March with Gordon Thwaite, who had become unexpectedly involved in the ongoing situation and turned up with a ute, and a property manager of mine named Steve who didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. Dorothy sent her off with a large container of soup, 3 frozen meals, and a potted herb garden that was frankly more ambitious than I thought was practical. But Renee seemed genuinely delighted by it. Standing in the doorway of the flat that afternoon, while Renee fed Daniel in the new living room and Dorothy's soup cooled on the kitchen bench. I thought about the moment in the Woolworths checkout queue when I had looked up and seen her. I thought about how close I had come to going to the self-serve machine instead of waiting in her line. How close I had come to seeing only a slow-moving checkout operator on a Tuesday afternoon and not looking at the angle of her neck. It is an uncomfortable thing to understand that your perception of a situation can be this comprehensively and confidently wrong for this long. That you can build a life on competence and professional judgment, and yet in the place where it costs the most, in your own family, you can operate for years on an unexamined set of assumptions that someone else installed in you. I have thought about what I would say to any man sitting in my position 18 months ago who was receiving a version of events from someone he loved and trusted. I would tell him, ask the other question. Not the question that confirms what you already believe you know, but the one that might change it entirely. A 30-second phone call to Renee, when Marcus first told me she'd left, would have found her within the week. She had not even changed her phone number. She told me later she had kept it the same for a full month in case someone reached out. Nobody did. I retired from the day-to-day operations of the business at 64. My property manager, Steve, who is considerably more organized than I am and considerably more comfortable with the software that runs everything now, handles what needs handling. I remain on the board in a governance capacity, which mostly means I read reports and ask difficult questions, both of which I was already doing. The transition took about 3 months longer than I announced it would, and Dorothy found this extremely predictable. On the first Sunday of every month, Renee brings Daniel to Fig Tree Pocket for lunch. He is a deliberate, observant child who takes a long time to warm to new things and then is completely certain about them. He has Dorothy's eyes and a quality of sustained attention that I do not know where he gets from, but that I find entirely admirable in a 10-month-old. He has recently identified the fig trees in the garden as a matter of serious personal interest and will stand at the back door pointing at them with the absolute authority of someone who has important observations to make and requires a larger vocabulary to make them. I am learning to be present for this. Not present the way I was present for Sunday lunches when Marcus was growing up at the table, nominally, while the real part of my attention was somewhere else. Present in the way where I put the phone in another room and sit on the back step and watch Daniel investigate the garden and allow that to be, without qualification, the most important thing happening. It is a different skill from any I developed in 40 years of commercial property. It is harder to measure, and the feedback loops are slower, and you do not get a settlement document at the end that confirms the outcome. You just keep showing up and hope that over time the person in front of you understands, at some level below words, that they are worth the full weight of your attention. I read a line somewhere, I cannot remember where, that said, the most dangerous inheritance you can give a child is a version of success that costs the people around them everything. I am not sure I have earned the right to quote that given my own record, but I find it useful to hold. To anyone listening to this story, watch carefully what your children learn from watching you, not from what you tell them. I taught Marcus to close deals. I did not teach him what to do when closing a deal requires you to look at another person as an obstacle rather than a human being. I showed him competence without the conscience that gives competence its direction. And then I spent 8 months accepting his account of events at face value because it required less of me than looking any harder would have. A family is not a business. The metrics are different. The losses are different. And you do not get to restructure and refinance your way out of the damage done to the people inside it. Daniel is pointing at the fig trees again. Renee is beside me on the back step with her tea. And Dorothy is inside making more noise in the kitchen than the amount of food she's preparing strictly requires, which has always been how she processes things. It is an ordinary Sunday in Brisbane. The river is doing whatever rivers do on ordinary Sundays. I put the phone in the other room before I came outside. I am paying attention. That is where I'll start.